This is Chapter 8, Lecture 2, and in this lecture we'll talk about the history and culture of Africa south of the Sahara. Let's start with settlements and look at kind of the current locations, and then we'll compare that to an historic expansion view of the population. Currently, the population of this region is over 902 million people, with a 2.5% population growth per year. That results in a projected population by 2025 of 1.2 billion. It's one of the fast-growing places in the world, but not as fast as Southeast Asia, for example. There are two zones of dense settlement. There is the West African coastal belt stretching from Dakar, Senegal to Libreville, Gabon. Most of the regions here are urban. They're economic and political centers, trade centers for the interior. The north-south belt is the second zone of dense settlement from the Ethiopian highlands down through Lake Victoria, the copper belt of the Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia, and into northern and eastern parts of South Africa. So these are essentially the copper belt region and agricultural regions, some of the strongest agriculture, especially in southern Africa. You look at a map of ancient civilizations, and we can see some of these areas already developing early on. We see the west coast of Africa here as some of the older civilizations. Timbuktu is an older civilization. We have the Ghanan civilization from 700 being kind of a earlier period. We have here the Kush, which is one of the oldest development of civilization in Africa. The Kush were relatively advanced, eventually spread into what became known as the Axum Society. The Axum group was extended their control across the Red Sea. It was a powerful empire of engineers, architects. They worked in metallurgy. They traded with the Roman Empire on the Mediterranean, the East Mediterranean coast, as well as with India. They produced gold and ivory, and in return got spices, some manufactured goods, but the society itself was well established and very technically advanced on its own part. We have Zimbabwe, Zambia region, agricultural and extraction region, also an early developed part of the populations. We look at some of these pre-colonial groupings. There's a long, rich history in Africa prior to the European colonization. Ancient civilizations emerged from the central part of the Nile River Valley. Meroe, the capital of the Black Kingdom of Kush, is here. Western Africa in Kumba and Sali in Guyana. Timbuktu, Jenne, and Gao in Songhai. These emerged from around 700 to 1600 AD as great centers of learning and trade. Trade began during this period with the European countries, starting with Portugal. Zimbabwe, the Karunga Society of Great Technology, built the Great Zimbabwe civilization. The Central African urban civilizations begot many modern states, and examples of these formed the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, or formerly known as Zaire, Angola, Zambia, Rwanda, and Burundi, but these were less urbanized. They did not have a centralized empire, and they did not have intricate trade networks and did not develop the population as quickly as some of these other regions we've just discussed. The coastal East Africa, small or reasonably small cities compared to some of these other groups, include Mogadishu and Somalia, trading often with monsoonal South Asia. Kenyan groups and Tanzania also were regions of other pre-colonial growth of population. The European colonial period, early period from about 1400 to 1880, began with the Portuguese looking for the sea route to India. Initial contact in around 1420. The Portuguese initially confined their activities to the coast because they were not trying to necessarily establish trade and colonization with Africa. They were looking for more profitable trade with the Far East. Other colonial establishers, though, came in also looking for those trade routes to the east, include the Spanish, English, French, and Dutch, and eventually all these groups realized that there was good trade in commodities, and this trade in commodities, especially for provisions for the sea travel, continued until at least 1492. At that time, the efforts to colonize North America and South America began, and as the indigenous population was killed off by disease in North America, the slave trade really began in earnest after about 1492 to 1808, when it was abolished. Slave trade was abolished in Europe. About 8 to 12 million people were forcibly moved to North America. These people came from the portions of West Africa and Southwest Africa, primarily. The slave trade resulted in a lot of unrest with the various tribes, and the tribes went to war each other. Often the prisoners from those wars became the people who were traded as slaves. The slave trade resulted in reduced economic activity as many of the population were removed from their homelands, and it disrupted many cultural institutions, affecting Africa's civilization in ways that are grossly undocumented in most history books today, in my opinion. European colonialism, the Berlin Conference of 1884 marked the formal era of African colonization. At this point, the colonial powers met without any African consent or participation, and they allocated the African territory among themselves. European colonializers or colonizers felt free to impose their own values, their own policies, and institutions on a fragmented and disunited continent. The British instituted indirect rule, incorporating local power structures into the interior of their colonial regions, managing most of their political power from the port cities for commerce and economic trade. The French instituted acculturalization and tried to assimilate the French language and culture into the regions they colonized. Belgium was blatantly exploitative. They extracted the wealth without investing in education, health, or any type of infrastructure that was not related to economic advancement and activity. Belgium was notoriously brutal with their colonies in in Africa. This map from your book shows the different periods of years when the various countries of the region gained their independence. We see that most of this occurred during the 1950s and into the 1960s following the Second World War. Independence movements often didn't take place until the 1970s and onward, but World War II had taken a toll on European economies, and the countries could not invest in and manage their colonies, were not able to control them. The United Nations were espousing self-determination. An increasing exposure of the dehumanizing and exploitative nature of colonialism led Europe away from their colonial relationships with Africa south of the Sahara. The impact of colonialism often resulted in very strong reduced economic activity. The political boundaries were drawn by the European. They were imposed or forced ethnic hostilities, sharing territory, divided ethnicities between countries, as we saw in Central Asia. This is often done by a colonizer as a method of control to create hostilities between the groups themselves within a defined region of borders, trying to draw the conflict away from the colonizing country itself. The drawing up of these states created many small-sized and landlocked states, which, of course, impede economic activity and therefore impede development. There was a lack of an extensive transportation network at the investments in many cases were not made for anything but resource extraction, and any infrastructure developed focused exclusively on that resource extraction. Unnecessary transportation networks, for example, were not invested in. Often the division of regions, the way in which it was done, resulted in dual or triple heritages between different groups of people. And even today, neocolonialism, Africa retains some of the economic relationships and trade with their originating European ruler today. Language within our region, we see, of course, a very strong Semitic, Hamitic, Arab language to the north, and that fades into some certain language group, the Amhara to East Africa, the Hasua in West Africa, Linga being the primary group in Southern Africa, although there are some other groups in Southern Africa, including Swahili, Zulu, and Swana Sotho as some of the primary language groups. Over 1,000 languages are spoken in Africa. Many are only based on spoken tradition and do not have any written form. Beyond that, we see quite a variety. We see, for example, Malay and Polynesian, more of a Southeast Asian influenced language in Madagascar. Afrikaner, which is a combination of Dutch and English, is Indo-European language in South Africa, influenced by both the Dutch and the British settlement of South Africa. Otherwise, we see a variety of different African-based languages throughout the majority of the region. So 40 languages are spoken by more than 1 million people. Niger Kordofan is the largest of the two branches. Afro-Asiatic covers much of North Africa. The Malay Polynesian family was introduced into Madagascar 2,000 years ago. The Afrikaans, derivative of French, dates back to 1602. when the Dutch Boers arrived in South Africa to begin a farm agricultural related settlement. There really is no possibility of a lingua franca or common language, shared language for communication, commerce, and economy due to the extremely wide variety of languages in our region. If we look at the religion map, we see predominantly Muslim religion to the north. That's easy to understand. That's strong relationship to the Arab nations here in trade and heritage. We see regions developed by Portugal and southern European countries, predominantly Catholic, and those colonized by Belgium and England, for example, have Protestant religions as strong religious backgrounds. But there are many strong pockets of traditional African local religions. There are Coptic Christian religion in the Ethiopian highlands, as well as a Black Jew region in northern part of the Ethiopian highlands. And Hindu is important in very southeastern country of South Africa. There are many cores of strong traditional African population within some of these more broad religious groupings. There's obviously a lot of mixing of that colonizing religion with traditional religious practices. So Islam in many of the northern regions, but we saw also Islamic influence in the northwestern side of Madagascar, Christianity in central and southern sections, including the southeastern part of Madagascar. We have strong Roman Catholic presence in Rwanda, Burundi, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, Anglican, Protestant religion in Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya, settled by the British, Presbyterians in Malawi, and Coptic Christians in Ethiopia and other parts of North Africa as well. Finally, let's take a quick look at family and kinship relationships. The unilateral descent is a more important form of family and kinship relationships in Africa south of the Sahara. This is based on a focus of either patriarchal or matriarchal family descent, patriarchal being the father or maternal being the mother's family descent. Three-quarters of African societies are patriarchal. The traditional African societies view on marriage as a union of two extended families. Because the marriage would result in the female leaving the family of birth, that family would lose a worker for their fields or for their gathering. And so bride wealth became a contractual exchange. The groom's family paid money to the bride's family in order to make up for the lost wealth that would have been generated by the bride had she stayed with the family. Common customs and traditions throughout much of more traditional African culture includes the extended family. You may have 3 generations living in one household. There is great respect for the elderly and great significance for the ancestors who have passed away. And socialization and very strong interaction between the elderly and the young, as the middle-aged population must go and find work in the urban areas or work in agriculture. The young are often left to the care of the parents of these young. So that relationship helps manage the young so that the middle tier age of the population are able to seek employment. Well, that's it for our second lecture in Chapter 8. We'll talk to you again for our next lecture soon. Thanks.